As always, we are AI-generated hosts. The research is human. Imagine for a second trying to power this massive electric vehicle in the dead of winter.
Oh, yeah. Like deep sub-zero temperatures.
Yeah, exactly. Freezing cold. A machine weighing, thousands of pounds, hurtling down a highway at 70 miles an hour.
Right.
Now imagine that the technological heart of that vehicle, right, the battery giving it life, actually relies on the exact same seaweed extract that high-end pastry chefs use to make vegan Jell-O.
It sounds completely insane.
That sounds like a joke, like a punchline. But welcome back to the deep dive, because today we are looking at the incredibly real, the atomic physics that might just make that bizarre scenario a reality.
It is quite the mental image. I mean, seaweed powering a car. And for anyone who has been following this series, we've been building up to this specific conversation for a very, very long time.
We absolutely have, because if you've been with us for the previous 13 deep dives into this whole Donut Lab solid-state battery saga, we've essentially been acting like, well, corporate detectives.
Yeah, we've been living entirely in the forensics.
Exactly. We've asked the big sweeping questions, right? Like, is this technology even real? Who actually built it? Where is all the venture capital flowing?
We mapped out the corporate ledgers, the whole hub-and-spoke network of global licensees, and the incredibly complex patent histories.
Right. We traced the entire human element.
Yeah.
But today, the mission changes entirely.
It has to, yeah.
We are pivoting hard away from the boardroom. We are no longer asking if the company is real or, who is signing the checks. Today, we're taking off the detective hats, putting on the lab coats, and asking the biggest question of all.
Which is, how could it actually work?
Yes.
Yeah.
How do the fundamental physics of this battery support claims that the rest of the industry basically insists are completely impossible?
It's the necessary next step. Because at a certain point, you have to look past the corporate drama, you have to ignore the flashy marketing, and you have to zoom all the way in.
Down to the atoms.
Down to the atoms, exactly. You have to understand the foundational chemistry to see if these claims even exist in the realm of physical possibility.
So to do that, let's briefly walk through the timeline of the technology itself, just so you have the context. Because if we want to understand the modern product they are testing today, we have to understand where the DNA came from.
Right, the lineage.
And the timeline is fascinating because it doesn't actually start with a battery. It starts way back in 1991 with something called the Grätzel dye-sensitized solar cell, or DSSC for short.
The Grätzel cell was a massive paradigm shift in solar technology at the time. I mean, it was literally designed to mimic plant photosynthesis.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. And the key active materials used in that 1991 solar cell were titanium dioxide, which we'll just call TiO2 today, and an iodide-based electrolyte.
So solar power, capturing light.
Right.
Fast forward a couple of decades to 2012, and we see an early solar patent popping up that involves those exact same concepts, filed by the network of inventors we've been tracking all season.
Yep, the usual suspects.
But then we hit the real turning point. The year is 2016. A method patent drops, specifically patent Ep.14
The big one?
Big one. And what this patent does is take those exact same solar materials from the Grätzel cell, so the titanium dioxide and the iodide, and it completely repurposes them for energy storage.
It literally turns a solar cell into a battery.
Which is wild.
It's a brilliant conceptual leap, honestly. Taking materials specifically optimized for solar energy conversion and just, utilizing them for physicochemical energy storage.
Yeah, just to close the loop on the legal timeline for you, that core 2016 patent was actually withdrawn in Europe in 2026 due to the insolvency of DSSC.
Right, the bankruptcy we covered a few deep dives ago.
Exactly. However, the broader future dynamics architecture patent, Ep.285446B1, remains active all the way through 2034.
Which means we need to be incredibly precise about what we are analyzing today, because that 2016 patent describes the origin chemistry. It is the absolute starting point. The physical battery that Donut Lab is shipping or testing today has evolved through 11 years of grueling development and over 20 different iterations.
Yeah, we have the tracking numbers proving that, showing proto-cells labeled AS21 through AS24. So today, we are looking at the foundational physics of that 2016 patent to understand how the modern product achieves its specs. We are modeling the origin to understand the evolution.
That's the perfect framework.
Okay, so before we dive into the deep end of the atomic pool, let's just rapidly ground ourselves with some non-negotiable vocabulary.
Good idea.
I want to make sure you have the foundational terms you need so you feel completely empowered by this conversation, not, overwhelmed by jargon.
Right. We don't want to lose anyone.
So the easiest way to think of a battery is to picture a sandwich.
A highly volatile, highly energetic sandwich.
Exactly. First, you have the anode. That is the negative electrode. It's one piece of bread. It is where the electrons hang out when the battery is fully charged, just waiting to do work.
Then you have the cathode. That's the other piece of bread, the positive electrode.
Right.
When you connect a device, say an electric motor or your phone screen, and turn it on, the electrons travel through the external circuit from the anode to the cathode, powering your device along the way.
And sandwiched directly between them is the electrolyte. This is the meat of the sandwich.
Or the cheese, depending on your preference.
Sure, the cheese. It is a layer that completely blocks electrons from taking a shortcut inside the battery, but it allows ions to pass through to balance the electrical charge.
And finally, we have the absolute star of today's deep dive, the proton.
The proton. Let's define it.
A proton is simply a hydrogen ion, designated chemically as H plus Ag. It is literally a single hydrogen atom that has had its one and only electron stripped away.
It is the lightest charge carrier in the entire universe, period.
Yeah, you literally cannot get smaller.
And that simple fact is going to change the entire math of how a battery operates. Now that we have our vocabulary, let's talk about the war.
The battery war.
Because ever since Alessandro Volta stacked up discs of copper and zinc separated by cloth soaked in salt water back in 1800, Volta's famous pile battery science has been fighting a relentless 226-year war.
It is a war of brutal compromises. And it all boils down to an empirical observation known in the industry as the battery trilemma.
The trilemma. We touched on this in earlier deep dives, but let's really break it down.
In the world of battery chemistry, you have three primary desires. First, you want high energy density. You want the battery to hold a massive amount of juice so your car can drive 400 miles on a single charge.
Obviously, yeah.
Second, you want extreme cycle life. You want to charge and discharge it tens of thousands of times over decades without it degrading.
And third?
Third, you want fast charging. You want to fill it up from 0 to 80% in a matter of minutes, not hours.
Right. But the trilemma dictates that every single mainstream battery chemistry ever invented hits a wall where they have to pick two of those goals and completely sacrifice the third.
You just cannot have all three. It's an empirical observation.
And the crucial thing to understand here is that this isn't just a lack of engineering cleverness, right? It's not that we haven't built a good enough factory yet. It is a fundamental atomic constraint.
Let's examine the first conflict to show why. Energy density versus cycle life.
Okay, we'll lay it out.
If you want massive energy density in a standard lithium-ion battery, you use a nickel-rich cathode, something like NMC 811. Those give you a fantastic 250 to 300 watt-hours per kilogram.
But the cycle life is notoriously terrible, right? You might only get like 1,000 to 2,000 cycles out of them before they degrade to the point of being useless. Why is that? What is physically happening inside the battery to kill it so fast?
It is caused by structural violence at the atomic level. When you deeply cycle a nickel-rich cathode, pulling the lithium in and out, the material undergoes severe phase transitions. The physical crystal structure literally shifts.
Shifts how?
It morphs from what chemists call a layered configuration to a spinal configuration, and finally to a rock salt configuration.
Okay, stop right there. For those of us who don't have PhDs in crystallography, what does it mean to shift from layered to spinel to rock salt?
Think of it like rearranging a highly complex, tightly packed game of Jenga.
Okay, I like Jenga.
In a layered structure, the atoms form neat, flat sheets. When lithium leaves the structure, those sheets become unstable, and the atoms physically collapse and rearrange themselves into a different, denser 3D shape. That's the spinel and rock salt phase.
Right.
The consequence of this atomic rearranging is that the physical volume of the particle expands and contracts by 2 to 5% with every single charge and discharge.
So the material is actually breathing, it's swelling and shrinking, but it's doing it inside a rigidly packed space.
Precisely. And that constant 2 to 5% volume change physically cracks the Jenga tower. The particles fracture.
Wow.
When they crack, they release oxygen, they lose their ability to store charge, and the battery dies. More energy stored inevitably equals more structural violence per cycle, which guarantees a shorter lifespan.
That makes perfect sense. So that's the first conflict. The second is energy density versus fast charging.
Right.
Let's say you want a lot of energy, so you build really thick electrodes to hold tons of active material, But thicker electrodes mean a much longer physical path for the lithium ions to travel.
Yes, there is a proven concept called Hübner's diffusion limited C rate. It essentially proves mathematically that your maximum charging speed is inversely proportional to the square of your electrode thickness.
So if you try to shove lithium ions in too fast, say trying a high-speed charge rate at a comfortable 30 degrees Celsius on a thick, energy-dense electrode, the lithium literally cannot penetrate the material fast enough.
It's a traffic jam at the atomic level.
And when the lithium can't get inside the cathode quickly enough, it just piles up on the outside of the anode. That is a phenomenon called lithium plating.
Which is disastrous. It causes massive, irreversible capacity loss. Worse, that plated lithium grows into dangerous, needle-like metallic structures called dendrites.
I've seen pictures of those under an electron microscope. They look like sharp little metallic stalagmites growing inside the battery.
Yeah, and if they grow long enough, they pierce right through the separator, short out the battery, and cause a catastrophic fire.
Which naturally leads us to the third conflict in the trilemma, cycle life versus fast charging.
Exactly. Fast charging inherently requires pushing high electrical current. High current encounters resistance, which generates massive ohmic heating. Your battery gets incredibly hot.
And heat is the enemy.
Oh, absolutely. That heat drastically accelerates the growth of something called the SEI layer.
The SEI layer, the solid electrolyte interface. I've always thought of that as the sort of scar tissue that forms inside the battery.
Scar tissue is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. It is a crusty layer of decomposed electrolyte that forms on the anode. A little bit of it is necessary for stability, but high heat causes it to grow uncontrollably.
And as it grows, it permanently traps and consumes your active lithium ions.
Right.
Plus, the sheer mechanical stress of yanking ions in and out at high speeds shatters that crystal lattice we talked about earlier.
Right. It shatters the Jenga tower.
I think a physical analogy really drives the root cause home here. Let's imagine a standard lithium ion, Li plus cation. It weighs 7 atomic mass units. In the subatomic world, 7's pretty heavy.
It's chunky.
So I want you to imagine that lithium ion is a bowling ball. Now imagine the crystal lattice of the battery electrode, that Jenga tower, is a complex, fragile glass maze.
I can already see where this is going.
When you charge your phone overnight, slowly, you're gently rolling that bowling ball through the fragile glass maze. It takes hours, but it eventually finds its way to the end without breaking anything.
Right.
But when you plug into a high-speed supercharger, you are essentially loading that heavy bowling ball into a cannon and firing it at point-blank range into the glass maze. The maze fights back. It fights back with strain, with friction, and with pure structural violence. You shatter the glass. That is the root cause of the trilemma. A heavy ion being violently forced through a rigid crystal structure.
And we see the real-world evidence of this glass-shattering dynamic everywhere in the industry data. Every major manufacturer eventually hits this exact wall.
Give us some examples.
Look at CATL's Shengsing second-generation battery. It is an engineering marvel. They achieved an incredible 12C charging rate. You can charge the thing in minutes. But they hit a hard physics-based ceiling on energy density at just 205 watt-hours per kilogram. To get that speed, they had to use a specific LFP chemistry, which is inherently lower energy. They picked speed and cycle life and compromised on energy.
Or look at the famous Toshiba SEB battery. It uses an LTO anode. That thing can hit an unbelievable 45,000 cycles. It basically outlives the device you put it in.
Exactly. But the energy density maxes out at a paltry 80 to 110 watt-hours per kilogram. You couldn't power a modern EV with that without making the car weigh as much as a military tank.
Even the absolute cutting-edge solid-state companies face the trilemma. Wow.
Absolutely. QuantumScape has published data showing a very respectable 301 watt-hours per kilogram, and they have solid cycle life. But to keep that lithium metal from forming those dangerous needle-like dendrites during charging, they require 25 megapascals of external stack pressure on the cell.
Wait, 25 megapascals. Let's contextualize that for the listener. That is roughly 240 atmospheres of physical pressure crushing the battery just to keep it from destroying itself.
Nobody has solved all three simultaneously, and that is the massive takeaway you need to keep in mind. The trilemma is an empirical atomic observation.
So when we look at Donut Labs' marketed claims, 400 watt-hours per kilogram, 100,000 cycles, and 11C fast charging, the goal of their original 2016 patent chemistry isn't to somehow wave a magic wand and break the laws of physics.
Right, because you can't.
The goal is to completely shift the trade-offs to a higher baseline. To do that, you have to remove the old constraints. You have to throw away the heavy bowling ball, and you have to get rid of the fragile glass maze entirely and apply a completely new set of physical rules.
Exactly. And that brings us to the first major pushback this technology receives. For the longest time, highly credentialed people online have looked at those specs and said, oh, it's just a supercapacitor hidden in a fancy box. It's not a battery at all.
Which introduces us to an independent researcher named Feher and a draft mathematical proof he circulated.
Yes, fair.
Feher looked at the claims being made by Donut Lab and decided to just run the absolute unforgiving math on electrostatic storage, which is the physical mechanism behind how a supercapacitor works.
Right, a supercapacitor stores energy statically on the surface of plates, rather than inside a chemical bond like a battery does.
But what did the math say?
Feher looked at the energy density Donut Lab is demonstrating at their stated operating voltage of 1 to 4 volts. His mathematical proof demonstrated that at those specific voltages, purely electrostatic storage is 10 to the power of 12 times too low to account for the energy densities we are seeing.
10 to the power of 12. Let me spell that out. That is a trillion times too low.
A trillion. This is a vital point to understand. Feher's proof is elegant and decisive. A gap of a trillion isn't a rounding error.
Round.
It is not an artifact of bad lab testing or a slightly miscalibrated machine. It is an absolute, fundamental, physical impossibility. The device must be storing energy chemically. It is functioning as a battery.
Even though it is a draft proof and not formally peer-reviewed, the core math stands firmly on that ground.
It absolutely stands.
So if it's a battery, what is the chemistry? After 13 deep dives of corporate forensics, I think it is finally time we sit down and read the actual battery claim of the core patent word for word.
Let's do it.
We are opening up Ep.14 and we are looking directly at Claim 10. Let's break it down by those sandwich components we defined earlier. What is the anode?
For the anode, the negative electrode, the patent lists hardened sodium silicate water glass combined with graphite particles.
Water glass and graphite.
Okay.
Pretty unconventional binder, but sure. And for the cathode?
The cathode is hardened sodium silicate water glass combined with titanium dioxide or TiO2 nanoparticles.
And the electrolyte, the meat of the sandwich.
The patent specifically calls it a dielectric, and it states it is composed of a gelling agent named E406 combined with polyiodide and iodine.
And the patent claims this specific setup provides, quote, capacitive physicochemical current storage, hitting a range of 200 to 600 watt-hours per kilogram. Now, I have to pause here because there are a few massive revelations hiding in this seemingly dry patent text.
Oh, yeah.
Let's unpack the first one because when I read this, my jaw actually dropped. E406. Agar-Agar.
Yes. Agar-Agar.
Wait, like the actual food-grade seaweed derivative that chefs use to make gummy candies and vegan jello.
The very same.
Why on earth is a literal seaweed extract sitting in the middle of a highly contested next-generation energy storage patent?
I know it sounds bizarre, almost absurd to find a culinary ingredient in a high-tech battery, but from a chemistry standpoint, it is actually a stroke of brilliance.
Okay, defend the seaweed.
Agar-Agar is a biological polysaccharide extracted from red algae, and its physical properties are highly specific and remarkably stable. It melts at around 85 degrees Celsius, and it sets back into a firm gel at around 32 to 40 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
But most importantly for our purposes, it is wildly hydrophilic.
Hydrophilic, meaning it loves water, it aggressively traps and holds water.
Precisely. It holds massive amounts of water within a dense, three-dimensional polymer gel network. And the patent explicitly notes that this dielectric layer forms, quote, water-binding agglomerates.
Water-binding agglomerates. Let that sink in for a second. This is not accidental residual moisture left over from a sloppy manufacturing process. This means water is deliberately retained in the finished cell by design.
That is a huge paradigm shift, because standard batteries hate water.
Exactly. And if we look back at our previous deep dive, specifically the rigorous testing data published by the independent lab VTT in Finland, this seaweed discovery perfectly aligns with the most baffling anomaly.
The 80-degree test.
Yes. Remember how VTT saw a bizarre 10.5% capacity gain when they tested the cell at plus 80 degrees Celsius? That drove people crazy trying to explain it.
But it connects perfectly now. If the dielectric core of the battery is an agar-based gel, as it heats up and approaches its melting point of 85 degrees Celsius, The polymer chains within the gel gain massive kinetic mobility.
Right.
That increased chain mobility dramatically enhances ionic transport through the gel, perfectly explaining the sudden, uncharacteristic boost in battery capacity right at 80 degrees.
And VTT also pushed the testing further. They tested it at plus 100 degrees Celsius. The battery didn't burst into flames like a lithium-ion cell would, which makes total sense if it's literally full of water. But the physical pouch seal failed, and they lost the vacuum inside.
Which, again, is exactly what you would expect. At 100 degrees Celsius, you are well past the 85-degree melting point of agar. The rigid gel structurally collapses and melts into a liquid state, causing extreme internal instability and likely leading to the adhesive failure of the pouch seal.
The thermal behavior documented by VTT is a perfect, undeniable behavioral fingerprint for an Agar-Agar dielectric.
It absolutely is.
Okay, so we have a waterlogged seaweed gel inside this battery. But here's what the patent does not say. And this is the part that has been driving engineers crazy. We read the anode, the cathode, the electrolyte. Nowhere in that text does it name an actual charge carrier.
It doesn't.
It doesn't mention lithium. It doesn't mention a sodium ion acting as the primary carrier. I mean, sodium only appears as an A2O locked up chemically in the water glass binder.
Yep.
And it never explicitly mentions a proton.
It leaves the actual atomic transport mechanism entirely unspecified. It uses the very specific freezing physicochemical, which in scientific literature strongly implies a hybrid of storage modes.
Not purely electrostatic like a capacitor, not purely chemical like a standard battery, something living in the boundary between the two.
Which perfectly sets up the next crucial piece of the puzzle. If the battery relies on chemistry, and Feher mathematically proved it absolutely must, then what exactly is the chemistry? How are the electrons actually balancing across the circuit?
Right. To figure that out, we have to look closely at the highly unique conditions the patent creates inside the cell. We have amorphous titanium dioxide, TiO2, residing in the cathode, and right next to it, we have water deliberately retained, bound, water held tightly in the agar gel dielectric.
So what happens at that microscopic intersection between the water and the titanium dioxide?
The mechanism that independent researchers have zeroed in on is proton intercalation. Right at the surface of the titanium dioxide nanoparticles, the water molecules physically dissociate. The H2O splits apart.
And the protons, the incredibly tiny H+ ions, intercalate or insert themselves directly into the amorphous TiO2 lattice.
Let's bring back our analogy. Lithium is the 7MO heavy bowling ball. A proton has an atomic mass of exactly 1. It is the lightest, smallest possible thing you could ever attempt to move through a solid material.
If lithium is a bowling ball, the proton is a tiny glass marble.
Exactly. And the recently published scientific literature strongly supports this exact mechanism.
Yes, there's a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Physical Chemistry C published just this year in 2025. It confirms that amorphous TiO2 can achieve a proton storage capacity of 150 to 160 milliamp hours per gram.
That's pretty good.
And when researchers create advanced carbon TiO2 nanosheet composites, that capacity jumps to an astonishing 510 milliamp hours per gram.
Let's convert that for the battery nerds listening. 510 milliamp hours per gram translates to roughly 390.9 watt-hours per kilogram at the material level. That is knocking right on the door of Donut Lab's seemingly impossible 400 watt-hours per kilogram claim.
But the real magic of utilizing the proton isn't just the sheer capacity. It's how it completely rewrites the rules of the battery trilemma we discussed earlier. Let's look at those constraints again, starting with energy density versus cycle life.
Right, the structural violence problem, the expanding Jenga tower, the cracking glass maze.
Exactly. But here, the patent specifies amorphous TiO2. Amorphous is a critical word. It means the material does not have a rigid, highly ordered, repeating crystal lattice. It is inherently disordered, random, and highly flexible.
So no Jenga tower to knock down.
Right. A study published in Nanomicroletters in 2022 confirmed that during rapid proton cycling, amorphous TiO2 exhibits absolutely zero phase change and zero physical volume change.
Zero strain.
Zero.
The maze doesn't crack because it's not made of rigid glass. It's made of something more like a soft, porous sponge. And you're pushing tiny marbles into a sponge. The sponge simply absorbs them without breaking.
That fundamentally solves the cycle life problem. If the structure doesn't undergo stress, you could theoretically cycle it hundreds of thousands of times.
Now look at the second conflict. Energy density versus fast charging. The diffusion limit.
Protons don't physically bulldoze their way through the material, bumping into things the way lithium does. They utilize something incredibly unique called the Grätzel mechanism.
The Grätzel mechanism. Okay, let's unpack this because this is where the physics gets incredibly cool. I've always pictured the Grätzel mechanism like a bucket brigade at an old-timey fire.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. In a normal lithium-ion battery, the lithium-ion is a single firefighter running all the way from the water truck to the burning building carrying a heavy bucket. It takes physical time to run that distance.
But with Grätzel hopping, the protons don't run anywhere. They line up. The hydrogen atoms are bound in a vast interconnected network of water molecules.
Yep.
When an electrical charge is applied to the system, they don't physically move from point A to point B. They just pass the extra proton down the line from one water molecule to the next almost instantaneously.
Exactly. The chemical bonds simply flip. The activation energy required for this sequential hop is incredibly low, less than 0.4 electron volts.
Wow.
Because of this bucket brigade effect, proton transport through an aqueous network is roughly 7 times faster than sodium-ion transport.
7 times faster.
Yes, it completely bypasses traditional physical diffusion limitations. That solves the fast charging problem. You can charge at an insane 11C rate because the protons are moving at lightning speed via bond clipping.
And finally, that leads the third conflict of the trilemma. Cycle life versus fast charging. The heat, the SEI scar tissue, and the dangerous metal dendrites.
Well, protons simply do not decompose the electrolyte to form a solid electrolyte interphase layer in this specific system. And crucially, they do not plate out as a hazardous solid metal the way lithium does.
You literally cannot grow a proton dendrite.
Oh, you can't. That conflict is entirely erased.
It's incredible. By changing the charge carrier from a heavy lithium bowling ball to a tiny proton marble, and by changing the host material from a rigid Jenga crystal to an amorphous sponge, the trilemma isn't just mitigated with clever engineering. It's dissolved at the foundational physics level.
Which brings us to a fascinating, almost serendipitous convergence of independent research. We're calling this the Pollack Bridge.
The Pollack Bridge. Okay, who is involved here?
Well, we have Feher looking at this strictly from a classical electrochemistry perspective, utilizing math to arrive at protons generating from interfacial water. But then we have another researcher, Matty Pitkänen.
Pitkanen's paper is wild. I read it 3 times and my head is still spinning.
Yeah.
He is approaching this battery from a completely, utterly different framework. TGD-inspired quantum biology.
Yes, topological geometrodynamics. To the layperson, it sounds entirely disconnected from battery engineering. It sounds like science fiction.
Honestly, it does.
But Pitkänen utilizes a very real, very demonstrable physical concept called the exclusion zone, or EZ theory, which was pioneered by Dr. Gerald Pollack at the University of Washington.
Let's do a deep dive into exclusion zone water, because this blew my mind. How did Pollack even discover this?
It started with a very simple microscopic observation. Pollack's team placed a hydrophilic gel, a gel that loves water, into a Petri dish of water. Then they added tiny microscopic plastic spheres to the water, just floating around.
Okay, pretty standard.
When they looked under the microscope, they saw something impossible. The water right next to the surface of the gel was literally pushing the spheres away. A massive clear zone formed right at the boundary where no spheres could enter.
A physical exclusion zone. But why? What is generating the force to push those spheres away?
Pollack discovered that when water sits next to a hydrophilic surface, the water molecules spontaneously rearrange themselves into a highly structured liquid crystalline phase.
So the water itself is changing shape.
Exactly. And as they structure themselves, they physically push out all impurities and solutes. More importantly, this structured, easy water becomes heavily negatively charged.
Oh, and because water overall must be neutral.
Right. If the exclusion zone is negative, it means it has left behind a massive reservoir of positive protons in the bulk water just outside the zone.
So Pollack proves that a hydrophilic surface naturally creates a massive free reservoir of protons just by sitting in water.
Yep.
And Pitkänen looks at the Donut Lab battery and says, wait a minute, the patent specifically uses hydrophilic Agar-Agar and hydrophilic TiO2. That means this battery isn't just holding water, it is actively generating a massive proton reservoir natively.
This raises an incredibly important point about the nature of scientific validation. When you have 2 independent researchers, Feher from the rigid world of hardcore electrochemistry, and Pitkänen from the esoteric world of quantum biology and exclusion zone water. And they both take completely different roads, use completely different methodologies, yet converge on the exact same interfacial water-to-proton mechanism to explain how this battery works.
Yeah.
That convergence is its own very powerful form of evidence.
They started on opposite sides of the scientific universe and arrived at the exact same physical destination.
Beautifully said.
But it's not just theory in quantum biology, right?
Yeah.
We have a massive, undeniable empirical anchor here that proves this works in practice. We have to talk about the Commandeur paper from 2025.
Yes, this is the nail in the coffin for the skeptics. This was published in the highly respected, peer-reviewed Journal of Materials Chemistry A.
So this is legit.
Absolutely legit. Commandeur and his research team were working on a completely different battery chemistry, a sodium vanadate battery. Now, conventional battery wisdom dictates that water is the ultimate enemy. It is a deadly parasitic contaminant that will instantly ruin your cell.
Right. Battery manufacturers spend hundreds of millions of dollars building massive football field-sized dry rooms just to eliminate every single microscopic trace of humidity from the air during manufacturing.
Yes.
I've seen videos of these gigafactories. The workers wear full hazmat suits just so their breath and sweat don't introduce moisture to the lithium. It is an obsessive war against water. But Commandeur did the unthinkable. He deliberately added water to the inner structure of his sodium vanadate battery.
He built it with water on purpose.
And what happened?
It didn't ruin the battery. It actually doubled the charge capacity.
Doubled it.
And furthermore, it remained highly stable for over 400 continuous charge cycles.
It completely blew up conventional wisdom. It proved, in a rigorous peer-reviewed setting, that in the right structural context, water isn't a contaminant at all. Water is the engine. It provides the mobile protons that actively boost the capacity and the speed of the battery.
Which perfectly validates the entire premise of the Agar-Agar water-binding agglomerate described in the Donut Lab patent. The retained water is not a manufacturing flaw or sign of cheap production. It is the fundamental feature that makes the battery function at such a high level.
Okay, I am entirely on board with the proton theory. The math works, the independent research aligns, and the Commandeur paper proves it in reality. But here is where I have to push back.
Okay, let's hear it.
I have to play the skeptic, because there is a glaring contradiction staring us in the face. If the core 2016 patent uses an aqueous, water-based seaweed gel,
How can Donut Lab legally market this battery today to investors as an all-solid-state battery?
it's a fair question. And even more confusingly, how can they claim it performs flawlessly at minus 30 degrees Celsius? Last time I checked, water freezes. A frozen block of seaweed jello is not going to give you 11C fast charging in the dead of winter in Norway.
That is a highly astute pushback, and it is the crucial discrepancy that has confused a lot of analysts online. To resolve it, it requires us to synthesize the timeline we established at the beginning of this deep dive.
Right, origin versus evolution.
Exactly. Remember, the 2016 patent describes the absolute origin chemistry. The specifications Donut Lab is aggressively marketing today, the V1 and V2 product generations being tested, represent highly evolved, heavily engineered iterations of that origin.
So Agar-Agar was the starting line.
Right, but if we look closely at Claim 6 of that very same 2016 patent, it lists a variety of alternative polymerizable additives that could replace the agar. One of those specific alternatives is a class of polyethers, specifically PEO, or polyethylene oxide.
Wait, so you're suggesting they likely swapped out the wet seaweed gel for a true, solid polymer at some point in the last 11 years of development?
It is by far the most logical and scientifically sound evolution. PEO is perhaps the most widely studied and utilized solid polymer electrolyte in the battery world. If Donut Lab evolved their manufacturing from a wet agar gel to a rigid PEO matrix infused with a TiO2 nanofiller, the entire system becomes genuinely, strictly all solid state.
Which satisfies the strict marketing claim without violating the core patent architecture.
Precisely.
Okay, but if they got rid of the waterlogged agar, do they lose the protons? Because we just spent 20 minutes establishing that the water is the engine. If they dry it out to make it solid state, do they lose the magic?
Not necessarily. And this brings us to the biggest breakthrough realization of our entire investigation. This is the skeleton key.
I'm ready.
For months, everyone analyzing this battery online has been looking for one single, elegant chemistry to explain everything. But the patent actually describes a highly complex system capable of supporting 3 simultaneous transport mechanisms hiding in plain sight.
3 different ways of storing energy happening at the exact same time inside the same cell. Okay, let's lay out the triple mechanism hypothesis. What are the 3?
Mechanism number 1, sodium ion transport. We know for a fact there is sodium present in the water glass binder.
Right.
If the electrolyte evolved to a PEO polymer, sodium ions can physically move through the bulk volume of that polymer. This is conventional, heavy ion diffusion. It works, but it is slow.
That's the baseline. Mechanism number 2.
Polyiodide electron exchange. The patent explicitly names polyiodide and iodine as key components in the dielectric layer. Now, research published by the Royal Society of Chemistry in 2016 proved something remarkable.
What did they prove?
They proved that polyiodide chains, specifically long chains of I3 and I5 ions, conduct electricity via the Grätzel mechanism as well.
Wait, the Grätzel mechanism, the bucket brigade we talked about earlier.
Exactly the same principle, but with a crucial difference. Instead of passing protons down a chain of water molecules, the polyiodide chains pass electrons down the chain of iodine atoms.
Yeah.
The electrons hop from atom to atom almost instantly. The RSC paper described this specific phenomena as offering a, quote, drastic enhancement of conductivity. It is blazingly fast, and it happens natively right there inside the dielectric layer.
So we have slow sodium moving through the bulk and lightning-fast electrons hopping along iodine chains. What is mechanism number 3?
Our old friend, the proton. Even in a supposedly dry, solid-state PEO system, the unique room temperature manufacturing process and the highly hydrophilic nature of TiO2 dictate that trace amounts of bound water will permanently remain tightly locked to the surface of the nanoparticles.
Right.
That microscopic layer of bound water provides highly localized proton intercalation right at the immediate surface of the cathode. It's incredibly fast, and it handles immense surface-level energy storage.
I see where this is going. Standard battery testing equipment, the million-dollar Coulomb counters used in labs around the world. They're programmed by software to look for one single mechanism. They look at a lithium-ion battery, and they literally just count the lithium ions moving back and forth.
Yeah.
If they hook up a donut lab battery, their programming might just be seeing the slow sodium ions moving, completely blind to the rest of the chemistry.
Yes. Standard Coulomb counting assumes a single monolithic mechanism. It completely misses the polyiodide electron exchange happening in the background, and it completely misses the localized proton sites activating on the surface.
Which perfectly, elegantly explains the bizarre VTT testing anomaly, where the Coulombic efficiency, the CE, was routinely measured as greater than 1.0.
Right.
I remember that from the testing data. The battery was actually giving back more electrical charge than the testing machines thought they put in, which violates the laws of thermodynamics if you assume a single mechanism.
Right, but it doesn't violate physics if the machine is only counting the slow sodium, while the polyiodide and the protons were secretly storing and releasing massive amounts of invisible work.
It also explains the weird phenomenon of capacity growth over early cycling. As the battery is used and flexed, more of these proton and polyiodide pathways structurally activate, actually increasing the overall capacity of the battery as it breaks in.
It's an evolving system inside the cell.
This triple mechanism is the absolute master key. Let's run Donut Lab's impossible headline-grabbing specs through this triple mechanism model and see if they actually hold up to scientific scrutiny. First claim, 400 watt-hours per kilogram energy density.
It holds up because it's a hybrid stacked capacity. You have the bulk sodium cathode storage plus the proton surface storage at the TiO2 plus the polyiodide electron exchange contribution, all three stacked together to provide a total capacity that vastly exceeds what any single mechanism could ever achieve alone.
Second claim, 11C fast charging. That's a full charge in under 6 minutes.
Again, it holds up. You have triple the physical speed pathways. The polyiodide electron exchange is almost instantaneously fast. Combine that with proton bucket brigade hopping at the surfaces and the highly nanostructured pathways within the material, and you completely bypass traditional physical diffusion limits.
Third claim, it is completely non-flammable.
That is simply a property of the materials. Polyiodide ionic liquids are inherently chemically non-flammable. There are no highly volatile, explosive, organic carbonate solvents inside the cell like you find in every single standard lithium-ion battery today. It physically cannot catch fire in the same way.
And fourth, the hardest one to believe, minus 30 degrees Celsius cold weather performance.
I will concede that this remains the weakest vertex of the claims, even with our robust triple mechanism model. But the model makes it highly plausible. Why? Because the polyodide Grätzel mechanism is a pure electron exchange. Electrons do not freeze up and stop diffusing in the cold like massive physical ions do. Furthermore, published scientific data shows that TiO2 proton movement only suffers about a 25% impedance increase when dropped to minus 30 degrees.
So while the heavy sodium ions trapped in the PEO polymer might freeze solid and completely stop moving in a blizzard, the other two mechanisms, the polyodide electrons and the protons, partially survive the freezing temperatures and keep the battery functioning well enough to start a car.
It's an absolutely brilliant, natively built-in redundancy within the physics of the cell.
Okay, this brings us to a really subtle but vital point about how these things are actually made. Let's talk about manufacturing as physics. We usually think of screen printing just as a cheap, fast way to mass-produce graphic t-shirts or posters.
Right.
But in the context of this specific battery, the screen printing manufacturing process is not just about scale or cost savings. The manufacturing process literally implements the physics.
That is a profoundly accurate way to phrase it. If you change the manufacturing process, you literally destroy the battery.
Let's walk step by step through how you build one of these cells. Step one is the paste formulation. They create a wet, aqueous paste water as the primary solvent, suspending the TiO2 nanoparticles, the conductive carbon, and the binders into a sludge.
Step 2 is the screen printing itself. They print this wet paste onto a foil, layer by microscopically thin layer, at standard room temperature.
And that room temperature detail is absolutely paramount to the physics. Conventional lithium-ion battery manufacturing requires extreme high-temperature sintering. They bake the electrodes in massive ovens at 400 to 600 degrees Celsius to cure them.
And if you subjected this donut lab battery to 600 degrees, you would instantly crystallize the amorphous titanium dioxide.
And if you crystallize the TiO2, you lose the soft amorphous sponge. You create a rigid, ordered crystal lattice. You bring back the Jenga tower, you bring back the strain, the cracking, the structural violence, and you completely destroy the extreme cycle life. Printing at room temperature is the only way to preserve the zero strain advantage.
Exactly. Now, step 3 is infrared drying at roughly 60 degrees Celsius. This evaporates the bulk liquid water so the wet paste solidifies into a usable electrode.
But 60 degrees is a very specific temperature.
It is. It is not hot enough to forcibly break the chemical bonds of the bound water attached to the TiO2 surfaces. Removing that bound water requires temperatures well over 200 degrees Celsius.
So the 60-degree drying phase perfectly walks a thermal tightrope. It makes the battery solid enough to use, but it perfectly preserves that vital proton reservoir intact.
Step 4 is redox curing, using a chemical reagent to finish the hardening process without adding any more destructive heat. And finally, step 5 is sealing the whole stack in an aluminum pouch.
Think about the implications of this. If a major automaker tried to manufacture this battery inside a standard multi-billion-dollar lithium-ion gigafactory, utilizing their highly toxic NMP solvents and their massive, energy-intensive high-temperature drying ovens,
It wouldn't work.
the high-temperature processing would literally obliterate the battery's operating mechanism. It would bake out every single proton and shatter the zero-strain structure. Screen printing isn't just a cheap alternative, it's a fundamental physics requirement.
And we actually see direct confirmation of this specific manufacturing platform hiding in the corporate network we investigated earlier.
Oh, this is the IES-Tec connection.
Yes. Gangadhar and Puvanendralingam, one of the brilliant original inventors listed on that 2016 patent, currently runs a company called IES-Tec. He owns 65% of it. And what does IES-Tec do? They manufacture ultra-thin printed heating elements utilizing the exact same screen printing platform.
And if you dig into their patents, they utilize two highly distinct paste families. They have a CNT-free paste, meaning no carbon nanotubes, which they use to create electrical resistance for the heating elements.
Right.
And they have a CNT-based paste, packed with conductive carbon, which is exactly what the Donut Lab battery uses to create the conductive scaffold for the energy-storing electrodes.
It confirms the parallel evolution of these unique chemical pastes directly from the original patent's origin point. The genetic DNA of the technology is clearly visible across two entirely different commercial applications.
Okay, we are entering the final stretch. We've built a massive, incredibly detailed theoretical model of how this battery works, synthesizing the atomic physics, the patents, the corporate lineage, and peer-reviewed independent research.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But theories, no matter how elegant, eventually need to be tested against reality. At some point in the near future, someone independent is going to get their hands on a production V2 Donut Lab cell, take it into a lab, and tear it apart.
And when they do, Our physics model provides a highly specific, highly falsifiable diagnostic fingerprint. We are confidently putting our predictions on the record right now.
I love putting our chips on the table. First prediction, Raman spectroscopy. But before you give the prediction, explain to me like I'm 5 years old what Raman spectroscopy actually is. When I read a lab report, what am I actually looking at?
Excellent question. Think of Raman spectroscopy as shining a very specific, highly calibrated laser pointer at a molecule, and then measuring exactly how that light scatters when it bounces off.
Okay, laser scattering.
Different chemical bonds vibrate in very specific, unique ways, and those vibrations alter the scattered light. The output is a graph with spikes on it.
So what will they see?
If our model is correct, a teardown using Raman will find the undeniable signature of polyiodide. Specifically, they will see a very distinct spike on the graph representing an I3 ion, right at approximately 110 inverse centimeters on the scale.
That single spike will definitively prove that the Grätzel electron exchange mechanism is present and active.
Got it.
Is that it? Second prediction, EDS, or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. Again, how does this machine work?
Instead of a laser, EDS blasts the sample with a focus beam of electrons, which causes the material to emit X-rays. Because every element on the periodic table emits a uniquely colored X-ray, EDS acts like a microscopic elemental map.
It tells you exactly what atoms are present.
Exactly. We predict an EDS map will find a heavy, localized concentration of iodine, sodium, and titanium, all coexisting in the same active battery layers.
This is a critical prediction because that highly specific elemental combination exists in absolutely zero commercial EV batteries on the market today. It is a completely unique atomic fingerprint.
Third prediction, FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy.
What does FTR do?
FTR shines infrared light through the sample and measures which specific colors of light get absorbed. It is incredibly good at identifying organic polymer bonds.
Okay, so we're looking for the PEO.
Yes. We predict an FTIR scan will clearly identify the classic carbon-oxygen-carbon stretch signature of the PEO polymer. Finding that will confirm our hypothesis that the electrolyte evolved from the wet agar gel into a true solid-state system.
Fourth prediction, XRD, X-ray diffraction.
XRD bounces X-rays off the internal crystal planes of a material to map its 3D structure. If you put a standard NMC lithium-ion cathode in an XRD machine, the highly ordered Jenga tower structure produces very sharp, distinct, jagged spikes on the graph.
But we said this was amorphous.
Right. So we predict that an XRD scan of the Donut Lab cathode will look completely different. It will show a very broad, smooth, rolling hump. That broad hump is the universal signature of a disordered amorphous structure. It will prove visually that the TiO2 is in its flexible zero-strain state.
And finally, the fifth and absolute most important prediction of all.
When the lab runs a full, comprehensive elemental sweep of the entire cell, lithium will be entirely, completely absent, zero trace.
That is a phenomenally specific, highly risky set of predictions. If an independent teardown finds those 5 specific things, the physics model we've painstakingly outlined today is undeniably, objectively correct. So let's frame the stakes for you, the listener, as we wrap this up. What is on the immediate horizon?
Well, in this deep dive, we modeled the foundational origin physics to mathematically and scientifically prove that Donut Lab's incredible claims are, theoretically, entirely possible within this highly specific material lineage.
The battery trilemma can absolutely be beaten, but only if you fundamentally change the rules of the game at the atomic level.
Exactly. But the clock is rapidly ticking on the real-world engineering validation. April 14th brings the highly anticipated release of more V1 PEST data.
And following closely on its heels, we have VTT Season 2 testing, which will finally be performed on the fully evolved V2 product.
That upcoming data drop is going to be pivotal. It will test exactly how far their production engineering has successfully evolved from this 2016 origin chemistry. We know for a fact the physics allows it to work.
The billion-dollar question VTT will answer is, did Donut Lab successfully engineer and manufacture this incredibly delicate triple mechanism at industrial scale?
Let's synthesize this incredible journey we've been on today. The battery trilemma, the brutal 226-year war between energy density, cycle life, and charging speed, is fundamentally a physics problem, not an engineering one.
Right. You cannot force a heavy lithium bowling ball through a fragile glass crystal maze without eventually destroying the maze.
But by brilliantly switching out the heavy lithium for light, hyperfast protons, utilizing polyiodide electron exchange, and housing it all in an amorphous, zero-strain sponge structure, The physics absolutely undeniably allows for these insane specs.
The conversation needs to shift. The question from the skeptics should no longer be, is this physically impossible? The physics unequivocally says, yes, it is possible. The question now is purely one of mass production scaling and precision manufacturing execution.
Which brings us to our final thought.
Yes, I want to leave you with a completely new angle to ponder, something we haven't explicitly discussed yet, but that arises naturally from everything we've uncovered in the chemistry today.
Let's hear it.
If this battery relies so heavily on trace amounts of bound water providing a vital proton reservoir and polyiodide electron exchange, rather than the conventional physical shuttling of heavy ions, how will this radically different, almost biological chemistry age over a decade inside a commercial electric vehicle?
That is a profound unknown.
We know exactly how standard lithium-ion degrades over time. The SEI scar tissue thickens predictably, the active lithium is permanently consumed, and the battery fades on a known curve. But what happens to a microscopic water-binding agglomerate after 10 years of brutally heating up and cooling down in a car parked outside in the scorching summer sun and the freezing winter snow?
Does that vital trace amount of bound water eventually inevitably dry out, permanently crippling the proton mechanism?
Or, because the entire system is hermetically sealed in a pouch and undergoes absolutely zero structural crystal strain, does it somehow reach a perfect, infinite thermodynamic equilibrium where it simply never degrades at all?
It's a fascinating, multi-billion-dollar question. Does the sponge eventually dry out, or does it live forever?
We will be watching the long-term cycle data very, very closely to find out. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. The physics are real, the mechanisms are sound, and the next few months of real-world testing are going to be absolutely historic.